Up next, we have When Your Game is in Limbo, presented by Randy Orenstein. And Randy joins us. He's a Toronto indie developer and community event organizer, best known for his work founding Toronto Skill Swap and organizing the developer focused content at EGLX. He has been in the games industry for 10 years and has been teaching game design at Sheridan and Centennial Colleges for the past two. Randy, how are you doing today?
Oh, pretty well, except for a broken webcam, but little can be done about that. So unfortunately, I shan't be gracing everyone with my beautiful brown mop of hair. I don't know. I was going to say golden locks, but that doesn't work. So instead, you get slides.
At least we get your beautiful voice.
There we go.
All right, Randy. Well, I'll leave the floor to you, and you may take it wherever you like.
Thank you so much. All right, folks. Welcome, welcome. Thank you so much for tuning in for this talk, and I'm looking forward to seeing where we all go together with it. So, Jason, thank you so much for the introduction. I'm going to talk a little bit about myself anyway. Just fill in some of the missing pieces, so to speak. So who the hell am I? I am a game developer in Toronto. I'm an indie. I've been working in this industry for about 10 years. I have trained at George Brown College for their game development program, which basically taught me 3D modeling and a bit of animation and texture work. And as Jason said, I'm best known for my community events stuff. So I've run a bunch of different game jams. I've helped run a bunch of different game jams. I've run educational events, seminars, talks. Generally, I'm hosting other people's content, so I'm not quite as used to speaking as I could be, although now that I've got a couple of years of teaching under my belt, it's getting a little easier. So in the development sphere, what am I doing? Well, not launching stuff. You will not have seen any of my work because it's not out there. Although I guess technically you can see the most notable, I suppose, is I did environment modeling for a game called Quench, and we won an award at MagFest for best art. So I am official. But fundamentally, part of what this talk is about is why you're not going to see any of my work out there yet. So let's move right along. What is this talk actually about? So it's not really a failure workshop, although it kind of has elements of that. We're going to be talking a lot about things that went wrong in the development of this game, but we're still working on it. So I'm not going to call it a failure workshop because I intend to actually finish the damn thing. But of course, who knows what'll happen, but no, we are going to finish it. And so what I want to do is give you a look into the design process that we've had for this project, as I have it on the authority of Damien Summer, and you can blame him for this, that looking at other designers' thought processes is interesting. So hopefully you will find that with me. But the core of this talk is about the rabbit hole and what it's done with our design process. But before I get into that, let's talk about what the game that I'm trying to tell you about is in the first place. So the game that I've been working on for the last 3.5 years is called Lex Machina. It is a tower defense game where the core hook of the game is that you are custom designing and programming the attacks and logic of your towers. So trying to add an additional layer of strategic depth over the standard tower defense gameplay model of, select towers to place at various spots and then select those towers' upgrade paths. In this, you are fully in control of what the towers are going to actually do, so you can prepare far more meticulously than you might for a different game. Gameplay-wise, we are in a pretty good shape, and we have a playable structure. We're nearing systems completion, but part of what that has cost us is what we're going to be talking about. So, rolling right along, let's talk about the rabbit hole. So first of all, for people who might not know the phrase, what is the rabbit hole? Rabbit hole is from Alice in Wonderland. When Alice follows the white rabbit, she goes into the hole and falls down into Wonderland, a world of random crazy bullshit. And that is more or less what happens in a dev cycle when you go down the rabbit hole. You follow some design concept or aesthetic or principle to the exclusion of everything else, and you end up tunnel visioning yourself into a land of weird and crazy bullshit. Our rabbit holes were sort of threefold, but really what they centered around was the tower design system, the actual mechanics that were going to implement this idea of custom designing all of your towers. And sort of alongside and intermingled with that was the visual presentation of the game's UI and our overall art style. All three of those things kind of had a separate rabbit hole, but they were all, I think, pretty deeply interconnected. And so let's start talking about them. First up, I want to talk about design. So this is a mock-up that I sent to my programmer at one point, so please feel pity for him. He is a long-suffering guy who has been a fantastic programming partner on this project, and constantly has to look at weird diagrams like this and try and figure out what the hell I'm talking about. But what was my intention? At its core, what I wanted the players to be able to do was replicate almost any kind of tower defense gameplay structures and mechanics within this system. So what did I want to include? I wanted to include capacitors that could save up power for bursts of energy. I wanted to have power management be a thing because it was going to add an economic level to the game and also act as a balancing medium within the tower design structure. I wanted you to be able to automate the logic of your tower, so figuring out how its targeting systems are going to give power to this system or that system at any given time. I wanted to have attack customization where you can set the different variables and structure the attack however you want. And I wanted to even have the ability to replicate, you know how in most tower defense games, they'll give you spells or instant use items or effects that you can sort of drop on the enemies from anywhere. Well, I wanted you to be able to build those right into your towers. So you would have complete authorial control as the player over everything that you were going to throw at the enemies. On the whole, it was a fairly exciting idea, and honestly, I still think it is. Most tower defense players and fans that I've shown this to get really excited at the concept, and we've had a lot of very positive playthroughs. But let's look at where we started with this. My first concept for how to implement this system, and this was actually before John, who's my programmer, John Smith, came onto this project. I wanted to use a wireframe circuit system, so basically a visual scripting system of nodes and wires to direct the flow of energy within your tower, which would then direct all of your various effects. Sounds good, right? However, I ran into a couple of problems. One of the big ones is that I have no knowledge of how circuits actually work, and I'm not a programmer, so my ability to design logic systems is a little limited. So that was problem number one, in that I just kind of didn't know what I was doing. Now, that can be, made up for with research and so on and so forth, but the second problem with it was a little more insurmountable. The games that I had seen these kinds of design systems for, notably a game called Engine of War by Michael Todd, the mech that you were driving around in, that you were using this circuit system to program and automate, had a bunch of different interrelating systems. It had sensors, it had shields, it had weapons, it had its engine that actually made the thing move, a whole bunch of different things, which you had to intelligently portion your power usage between as you were playing the game. So essentially, the mech had a bunch of different verbs that you had to then create automated balancing systems between, and it led to some really interesting gameplay. Towers in a tower defense game have one verb, and that is shoot things. So there wasn't really anything for a circuit system to do because there wasn't anything to divide it up between. There's this fundamental problem that it just didn't match the core of what the gameplay was actually going to be. And that wasn't so great. Fortunately, I have friends, and they like talking to me about my dumb ideas. And a conversation over sushi with Droken, or Alex Martin, who's a designer. He did Probability Zero and Starseed Pilgrim and a bunch of other stuff. Very clever person. But a conversation with him led to a complete overhaul, moving away from a circuit system in favor instead of a statement-based design system. So This would let us use plain language for players to build attacks out of essentially sentence pieces. It seemed reasonably simple, right? So we used if, then, and which statements. So we have, if your tower sees this enemy, then fire a shot at it, and if that shot should have a special effect, that shot which will freeze it or turn it into a hamster or whatever it is you want it to do. Seems really simple compared to the circuit system, easy to design. It was something I could write out really easily without my programming knowledge having to be leveled up at all. And it worked fairly well. This modular system of statement-based design was what we ran with this game for several years. Now, obviously, the image that I'm showing you is not our final in-game art. This was, I think, the first mock-up I ever did of this system. I'll be showing you more of what the polish looks like later. But this system had a couple of problems. One of the big ones is that it essentially focused most of the design effort that a player would make into the economy of the tower. So rather than focusing on how cool the attack is, it would focus on how much that attack is going to cost and how to balance power between that attack and other attacks. So I'm talking about power again. We didn't lose the power idea when we moved into this from the circuit system. We just focused on power equals rate of fire. So we had your rate of fire being set by the various parameters that you set within your attack. So if you want it to be super high damage, it will also fire slowly. Simple. Your towers can also do multiple attacks. So once you have them doing things, you have to sort of balance out the power between these different attacks, or they'll just cut their rate of fire in half. This led to a few problems. One of the biggest ones was that this system basically forced all of the tower designs to go into this sort of middle ground of meh, where almost always the optimal choice would be the setting of 3 out of 5 for all of your various variables, because that was the only point at which it would do reasonable damage and not take forever to fire. That kind of balance point is just not interesting, right? And it also was locking out high tier play where players wouldn't be able to get to really have crazy looking effects going on because they couldn't afford it with their power levels, which was kind of punishing and was blocking fun. Added to that was that the complexity within this system, the area where there really was the most granularity and refinement in terms of how the player got to control their tower's function, was in the targeting system. And so it was all about basically when an attack starts to draw power. And that would be determined by whether or not its if statements were triggered, basically whether the bool was true. And so we devised this complicated if statement system using nested and ors and all of these different elaborate things so that you could really precisely tell your tower when you want it to shoot and what you want it to shoot at. Okay, but the problem there is that A, it's not easy to teach, it's not intuitive, and unless you're a programmer, just getting that logic down pat is tricky. Also, it's not good for starting players because they don't know what targeting priorities are going to be useful. So all in all, it is a fairly high-end gameplay system, but it's also where almost all of the really granular customization within the tower design system was focused. So it ended up being this big misplacement of energy. And we spent a very long time refining this and refining this and refining this and going through multiple iterations. And again, once we get into UI, I'll actually show you some of those. But it now especially feels like we were just completely off the mark. Several years later, another conversation with Droken. Droken gets high levels of featuring in this talk. But he basically came over and played through the latest iteration of it and recognized where the energy levels were forcing you to sort of middle grade out all of your attacks and all this other stuff. And he was just like, well, have you tried just cutting out the power requirements entirely? Like, where's the fun in this? And then we talked a bit more, and he talked about potentially doing a modular system for designing the weapons as opposed to um, a statement-based system. Now, this was great as far as I was concerned. Um, we ripped it all out. I went farther than he expected me to with regards, because he was just like, well, build a version to prototype it and see what you think. Instead, I went completely whole hog and ripped everything out. But here we are now. This is the current iteration, which is this modular system where now the primary granularity and focus is on actually designing the attacks. You get to add these modules to your attack, which determine whether it's going to do various things. So there are modules that are as simple and sort of boring as increase damage or increase rate of fire, but then more interesting ones like fire multiple projectiles, or slow the enemy, or chain to new enemies on impact, or make the enemies explode on impact, or a variety of other happy things. And it allows for the focus of the game design or the tower design process to now be back on the actual fun part, which is watching things explode. I feel kind of dumb that we didn't start with this, and especially because this was something that we had actually considered early on in the design process. We had talked about doing this sort of modular thing where you just add little modifier pieces onto your attacks, and we rejected that idea. And when I say we rejected that idea, I mean I rejected that idea, and I was being dumb. I had this idea that I wanted it to have this programmery feeling. I still had the leftovers of this node-based circuitry system sort of fermenting in my mind. And so I was like, oh, no, that won't be fun. And, 3.5 years later, now we know where the fun actually was. So that sort of sums up where we went with regards to game design, and actually realized as I just went through this that we skipped an entire portion of design iteration, which was this attack sequencer idea, where you'd get to determine if this happens, then this, then this, then this. But frankly, it never really worked very well. So we ripped it out and replaced it with this modular one. It was sort of a stepping stone into it. You don't need to know more. It was boring. So now I want to talk about UI. And UI was another area where the rabbit holing of this project ate a lot of time and energy. The UI of this game was very important because, given our emphasis on our tower design system, that essentially meant that about 50% of this game was just UI. That tower design is a menu system. And getting that good is very tricky. As those of you who have done it know, UI is one of the most difficult disciplines within game development. It requires a huge amount of UX and design understanding, visual art skills, and in general, a lot of just time and effort and energy. And the more complicated the UI is, the more difficult it is to make it work, especially in a way that players can handle. And, throughout the process of designing this game, we tried to move sort of from this utterly complex thing to its simplest possible iteration. So I'm just going to show you some different steps that we went through. But one of the big reasons that this ended up costing us, and I consider it to be part of the rabbit hole, is that I have a problem with gray boxing. I don't like it because I think I'm a visual artist first and a designer second. I want it to look good and have a feeling of polish in order to really get a feel for playtesting it. So that meant that we went to a high level of polish at every phase of iterating on this design system, which of course takes a huge amount of time, consumed a lot of testing time, a lot of iterative cycles. And, did it lead to improvements? Absolutely. I mean, we moved from this sort of box-like system to a far more elegant vertical panel with pop-up menus that was largely due to a wonderful conversation that I had with Taylor Baiwu, who ended up putting basically a lipstick drawing on a napkin for me to put as a menu concept, and we ran with that for quite a while. And it led to a much nicer, cleaner feeling to the UI overall. But the thing is, I was still taking it so that every time we made a change, I wanted it to be fully functional and at a decent level of polish. So it was just eating a huge amount of time. So now this is our current UI structure for the build menu. And looking at this, I'm pretty happy with it, but it's really not borrowing a lot from the earlier iterations. There's completely new art. The structure is somewhat similar, but that structure could have very easily been done with gray boxes. Realistically, I think the iteration cycles on this game could have been so much tighter if we had just done gray boxing rather than waiting to get the art up to this really polished level, putting all of this energy in every single time we change the design system. And it ate a lot of time. It also ate a lot of creative energy and sort of enthusiasm because, every time I would have to go back to the refactor. Was I improving my skills? Sure, actually. It was valuable for that. But at the same time, it was like going back to the drawing board over and over and over again over years. And speaking of going back to the drawing board over and over again, I want to take you on a quick journey through some of the art styles that this game has gone through, which is another area where I kind of rabbit holed. While we were working on all of these design systems, whenever I needed a break, I would go and redo all the art. So it started out with this sort of abstract weirdness, moved into a flat color system. Then I decided that the UI needed to be translucent and white and therefore completely unreadable. We went through many iterations of our enemies. We just refactored over and over and over again until finally getting to where we are now. And am I happy with where we are now? Yes, kind of. But again, this ended up being a huge amount of time and a huge amount of effort. And I'm calling these all rabbit holes for a very specific reason. Because by the time all of this was accomplished, we had a major accomplishment. We had a systems complete, very functional, playable game. Hooray! We had no levels. We had no content. We had spent all this time polishing and polishing and polishing the core systems and the presentation of those systems that we ended up stuck in this situation where, sure, we've got a bunch of good stuff, but 3.5 years in, we have 2 playable levels, and one of them right now, as I just checked this morning, is broken. So we kind of don't have the game portion of the game. And this has led to a real problem for me. And this is where I want to talk a little bit about some of my personal psychological issues around this and why this rabbit holing has cost so much. One of the big ones is this feeling that I've had where, okay, we have pushed so hard to get here. We have this amazing design system. It's fun to use. It's actually kind of intuitive. I think we're in a good shape. Aren't we done? Isn't that it? Like, is the game finished? No, we're actually still basically at ground zero as far as developing a launchable goes. And I will freely admit that this is an issue of my own perspective, and I really probably should have a more positive outlook on it. But the emotional exhaustion that I've had of getting it to this point and then realizing, oh shit, this is just the foothill. Now it's time to climb the mountain. I have to build 50-odd levels. I have to polish up every single interaction. I have to fully design and balance out the game's economy of when it gives you pieces and when you get to level up and which enemies appear when and all that other fun stuff. But at this point, I'm kind of exhausted. And it's been actually very hard for me to get down to actually building levels for this thing. Even though I just had my programmer build a suite of level design tools, which actually make it quite nice to build, I'm still finding it just very hard to sit down and do it. And in a weird twist, I blame LARP for this, and I'll explain why. For longer than I've been a game developer, I have been playing and running tabletop role-playing games and LARPs. And the effect this has been kind of interesting on my design brain, where I am very used to setting up elaborate worlds, plots, NPC interactions, political systems, all of this stuff before the game starts. And then the actual gameplay sees the players take what I've done, and we get into this improvisational back and forth riffing where everything falls apart and comes back together in beautiful ways. And there's this constant interplay between the players and myself as the ST who's running the game, or dungeon master, storyteller, whatever. And so that's been very much what I'm used to, where you prepare the field, you get all the systems ready, and then you give it to the players. And that's when the game starts, but you're not still curating everything. You're not authoring everything. The players have a huge part in this collaborative storytelling experience. And that's very much what I think I've been used to and sort of centered around, because I mean, I still do it. I love doing these sorts of games. But I realized that with both the game that preceded Lex Machina, which was called Archive, which I worked on for 5 years, and essentially got to the same point that Lex Machina is at now, where we both got to the systems complete level, where we have this vertical slice, everything's ready for the players to get into it, but I haven't authored all the content because my brain just sort of doesn't take me to that place. There were no levels. There was 1 level in Archive, there are 2 levels in Lex Machina, and a bunch of really polished systems. And so it's kind of a peculiar thing to blame LARP for, but I think it's a very interesting thing that I sort of recognize in myself of why I'm having this design blockage and trying to think about ways to get past it. I'm not 100% sure I have a solution. I think probably hiring a level designer is going to be the real answer. But it's interesting to think about how I could potentially shift development into a more player interactive mode for game content. But fundamentally, I think that that's not going to work for this project. So overall, that's brought me to a place of almost not wanting to touch my own game. And I've been working quite hard to try and get past that. And I'm sure my programmer is quite frustrated with me because he keeps on messaging me saying, Randy, what should I work on now? And I'm like, I have no idea. I haven't looked at any of the design docs in a week. Leave me alone. And that's not good. But at least I'm still paying him, so he's just getting a vacation, which is good. But still, not great for our overall design cycle. So pulling back from all of this, let's try and extract some teachable moments, I suppose. So lessons learned from working on this design system, I'd say the biggest one I learned is that simplicity is definitely preferable to complexity. And I mean, this is a somewhat of a duh, of course, moment within design. But for someone who likes to put together very complicated systems to try and give players this high level of autonomy, trying to both do that and accomplish the elegance of a simplistic system is a hell of a challenge. And we sort of, I think, have gotten at least close to it in the end. But it's taken 3.5 years of development to get there. Next, granularity. Focus on where granularity should be and where it shouldn't be. An element of how this has worked for all of these elements, both the UI, the art, and the overall design of this design system, has been that the granularity is often placed in the wrong area. We had all this focus on our targeting instead of the weapon system. And that was where the granularity really should have been all along. So examine your designs for where they are becoming granular and make sure that that extra energy is being put towards something that the players are going to enjoy. Granularity equals time and effort. The more there is to learn, the harder it is to teach, and the more effort a player will have to make to get through your tutorial and actually understand what the hell you're doing. Not to mention the challenge of tutorializing the system in the first place, which is this whole other thing. And we don't have a tutorial right now, so I don't have to talk about my struggles building one yet. And finally, finding the fun. This is not an uncommon statement, but you need to find the fun within your design. And it's kind of embarrassing to me that it took 3.5 years to realize, oh, wait, players want to focus on doing the attack in a fancy way rather than just the brain of the tower in a fancy way. And I guess in my defense, or in our defense on a development level, we had a lot of playtesting over those years, and we had a lot of very positive feedback. So it wasn't that the game wasn't fun at all. It's just that usually in the playtesting, players wouldn't actually touch that targeting system. They'd go straight to the other parts of the design, and they'd have fun with it because it still was allowing them this level of agency. But it really took a fair amount of time before we realized, oh, wait a minute, where do we need to actually focus things here? And what are the things that players are going to really care about? It's going to be making the attacks themselves cool, not all this nested if statement bullshit. So I very much hope that this talk has been interesting and maybe even useful to you. I apologize if it wasn't, and I would love to take some time to answer questions if you have any. So, Jason, handing it over to you. And feel free to Twitter at me.
Yes, sorry, I was struggling to find my mute button. Thank you, Randy, for that. So if anyone has questions for Randy, just let us know in the chat. I have a few here for you. Not sure if this is relevant, but this question, what do you do when you've overhauled your UI, but there's a ton of screenshots out in the wild now misrepresenting your game? And I'm not sure if you've experienced this with this game, but do you have any suggestions for people who find themselves in that situation?
Kind of. So it's interesting. So I've been having a bit of a Twitter conversation with somebody about this idea of leaks and the effect that they can have on your game. And I know you're not talking here about a leak, you're talking about something deliberately released, but when things have changed significantly and now that old information is essentially misrepresenting. I mean, first of all, there's not a lot you can do about it on a fundamental level, right? It is not possible to take images off the internet, as we all know. And the more noise you make about taking them away, the more attention people will pay to them. Really, I think it's a question of looking at the degree to which your marketing system has already integrated those old screenshots and how much money you've spent on that and how much pull they've had. And then you determine whether or not you want to move ahead in your marketing with the new systems or maintain them and then have it be a launch surprise that, hey, look, we got some upgrades. And I don't know if there is a right answer or a point at which the ratio becomes more or less favorable, but fundamentally it's about community expectation management, and it depends on what the UI overhaul is. If it's just an art overhaul where the UI now looks a lot prettier, just start including that. People will forget the old stuff or tell you that they liked it better, but either way, you're still moving ahead. If it's a serious systems overhaul where the core functionality has changed, and especially if you've taken away some functionality that players might have expected, that's where you might get into a bit more trouble, and where you might want to try and use something like a dev blog or press release to explain the logic of your decisions, which will hopefully help make people who are dedicated enough to your game that they're going to get upset about missing out on something you've taken away. You'll help be able to manage their expectations and keep them in a positive vein. So I hope that's helpful.
Yes, great. Thank you. We have a few more questions coming in from the chat, starting with the first one. Hi, Randy. Great talk. What are some of your tips and advice on continuously staying motivated throughout the development cycle? I've heard of just increasing the amount of design experience, and it comes with time. However, I was wondering if you had any tips on retaining focus and motivation through the course of the project development.
Well, yes and no. Yes, I might have a couple tips. No, because I'm currently suffering from that problem myself and I haven't solved it. So take these all with a grain of salt. I think that maintaining motivation and focus is one of the more difficult things in long-term projects. And I don't know if there is a particular way that you can focus your development to solve that problem. What I think is important is what you do in your free time. And one of the tools which I have both used a lot and heard from others is very effective as a way to sort of reset where you are mentally with regards to design is to do a game jam. And the reason for that is that when you're working on a long-haul project, you're going to be stuck in individual phases of development, like pre-production or production or whatever, for months, if not years. And getting lodged into one portion of a design cycle can really eat your soul and doesn't give you a lot back, especially if you're working with a large team and so progress is incremental and everything is by committee and all these kinds of problems, right? It can get very frustrating. Um, Going out and doing a game jam, finishing a project in a weekend, in a day, in a week, whatever, it sort of resets your brain in a way because you get to go through every phase of the development cycle all the way to launch with an idea that no one else needs to care about, with an idea that no one else is judging. So you can do whatever nonsense you feel like. You can get out all your yayas and all the ideas that you're frustrated you couldn't include in your core design for your big game, or weren't able to explore because of your energy focus being there. And you can get all that sort of out and express it and have fun with it. And at the end, you either do or don't have a functional prototype, but who cares really? Because it's the experience that is going to do the most good for sort of resetting your mental model of what it feels like to do development. So that's the most sort of direct thing I can think of to help with that issue. Other things are just the more simple elements. Take a break, take a vacation, read a book, watch a movie, get really invested in a series. Get your mind into some other creative mode to help make sure that there is a difference when you go back to work. Make sure that it doesn't just feel like today is the same as yesterday, is the same as yesterday, is the same as yesterday, is the same as yesterday. Do things that get your creative juices flowing in other areas that can help sort of reset your perspective on what it is you're working on and help keep it fresh. Beyond that, I honestly am not sure. I mean, right now, I've personally hit this wall and I'm trying to figure out how to get past it. And it's tricky. And one of the things that I have been doing, which is probably not the correct choice, is I have other projects I'm working on. And I've put a lot of effort into those when maybe I should have been putting them into this one core project. But so I wouldn't exactly call that a solution, if not possibly even part of the problem. But it is a thing that I've been doing. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I hope so.
As a bit of a meta question, does does talking about it and doing like a presentation of this style, do you find that works as kind of a creative outlet? Does that help kind of get you out of a box to just be like, oh well, this is the problem, and I can now look at it from a different point of view, or you haven't found that from this?
I would say emphatically yes. Actually, I not only have had a bunch of new design ideas for the game as I was writing this talk, but preparing this talk helped put the entirety of the design process in focus for me. When I first came up with the idea to do this talk, it was a very sort of glib description that I gave Jason, and I wasn't really sure what I was going to talk about. But over the course of writing this thing, a lot of aspects of the development cycle that I've been in and aspects of my own psychology as I've been doing this sort of crystallized, and I realized, oh, wait a minute, that is what I'm doing, isn't it? Like the whole thing about LARP, I did not realize that until I was writing this talk and went, oh my God, that's exactly what this is. So yes, I think that anything which allows you to take this pulled back perspective view, look at it with sort of a retrospective hindsight is 2020 eye, can be very valuable. And whether you end up presenting it to people or not, I think it can be a good way, again, to sort of reset your perspective on your project, which can help you apply your energy to it with fresh enthusiasm when you get back to it. You know, postmortems are very good, but during modems can also be really valuable, I think.
Mm-hmm. And the reason I was asking that is oftentimes I feel we can feel very insecure talking about something if we haven't kind of seen it through the other end. So, you know, right now you're at the point where you're still struggling with this. You don't necessarily have the answer, as you're saying, but I just want to highlight how just the fact of talking about it, the fact of just shining the light on it and not shying away from it and putting it out there and sharing it with others is in fact actually a part of a solution, despite not, you know, you're still trying to find the solution that works. But it's interesting that the means of finding the solution is a bit of a solution in and of itself in this case.
I'll put it like this: I certainly hope so. I think that that's a good insight. And I'll tell you this, I had to be talked into the validity of my topic uh, by some other developer friends of mine who I called up and was just sort of like, I haven't even launched this thing. I don't have a title out there. Who the hell wants to listen to me talk about game design? Not listing all of my students who are paying to do it anyway, but basically getting told about the validity of it, and this whole thing is a bit of a validating experience as well, just from, the standard indie developer issues of imposter syndrome, and especially where I'm sitting here with an unfinished game, uncertain about its future, uncertain if it has a market, utterly no idea about what I'm going to do to launch it, let alone complete it. And I'm giving a talk on it to the grand total of no one who knows about this game. It took a little nerve, and it took a little getting psyched up by other people, but I think it definitely was a valuable experience. And so I would say that I would encourage others to do this kind of thing. Put your projects out there before they're done, and especially if you're hitting a problem, see whether or not you can sort of crowdsource solutions as well. It's not a bad idea.
Well, I'm glad that you were that you had that support and that you did bring this, because it was a very interesting talk, and it's we're very much in that mindset of whatever we put online, whatever we put out there has to be perfect, and to embrace the imperfection, I think, is a wonderful thing. But back to the question we have another question here in the chat. When you put a bunch of work into UI and reset the visuals in order to fit a design evolution, have you ever done or thought about doing it in the other direction, revisiting a design to fit the visuals?
Huh. So this is I can see in the chat. This is Droken's question. So this is the guy who has helped me significantly through the development of this game. Short answer, no. I haven't actually done that. It's an interesting perspective of basically taking the art first and then extracting the design from that. I'd imagine there are people who have done stuff like that, but it strikes me as a little counterintuitive, but kind of interesting. So no, I haven't done that. And it strikes me as kind of a backwards way of looking specifically at UI. Like if we were looking at game design as a whole, here's a tile set, build a game using it based on the themes that are in the tile set, etc. That makes a little more sense to me than doing it with UI, given that UI is all about facilitating systems functionality. And without the system, the UI doesn't have a purpose. So I'm not sure how well that reversal would work. Yeah. I don't know, Alex, did you have a specific example of this you were thinking of, or?
So there is a
Just
bit of a delay.
watching the chat. Sorry,
There's a bit of a delay for what they hear us being able to read and convey. So I'll just give it a couple seconds to see if they have the time to reply to that.
For sure. So it's an interesting question, but it's just the inherent nature of the purpose of UI as information and system access makes it sort of going the opposite direction. Like I could see it being a fun jam exercise, but I don't know how easily it would really result in a solid design. But yeah, I'll give Alex time to think of that.
Maybe a good idea for your next jam session.
Possibly, yeah. Of course, then we got to figure out where I'm pulling the UI from.
So when they say revisiting a design to fit the visuals, is this, and I'm coming at this kind of naive, but are we talking about the concept art or something else?
I think what Alex is talking about is basically taking a existing menu system in terms of its layout, its aesthetic, its options, etc., and then trying to tweak the underlying design of the system that menu is supposed to be facilitating to suit what exists in the menu, rather than tweaking the menu to suit what might be different in the design of the system. I think that's what he was talking about. Where basically if you put a bunch of work into a UI concept, let's say, that's really, really pretty,
Hmm.
but it's just a bunch of pictures to start with, designing a system to suit that UI design, as opposed to coming up with a system and then designing a UI to suit the system.
Hmm. So a bit like kind of like designing the clothes and finding the model after versus designing the clothes for the model. I don't know if that's a good analogy.
It's tricky. So they're just looking at Droken's response. The
Yes.
exhaustion that I've had, I don't know if it's because the design was put ahead of the visuals. Um, because even just going back and doing artwork is currently kind of exhausting to me right now. I think it's more that the entirety of the content push was about this system as opposed to about expanding the actual playable structure of the game into a fully realized product. And now that we've gotten there, the idea of pushing for that extra element, which is not the extra element, it's the base element, but we're treated it as an extra element all through development, is a little harrowing to me.
Hmm. All right. Any other questions before we wrap up this talk? So I think that is pretty much all the time we do have for this slot specifically. So Randy, thank you so much, for sharing the struggle with everyone and kind of opening up on your design process and where the challenges are there. Would you like to direct anyone? So I see you have that's your Twitter handle on the screen right now.
Yep.
And then,
Feel free to add me on Twitter. I will try to add you back. And feel free to DM me if you like. And I think my DMs are open. Um, but yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to give this talk, Jason, and for hosting this whole event. I'm really happy to see that even though the in-person event wasn't able to work because of Corona, we still got to have this really cool cycle of talks and content to put out there for everyone. And I'm looking forward to seeing what you come up with next.
great. Well, thank you very much. And I hope you have a great afternoon, Randy. We'll definitely fill you in on updates as to our next initiatives as they come out. So keep an eye out for all XP from all XP channels to get updates